Welcome, Miko. Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you today again. I'm so blessed to have a call, an interview with you, Miko. Um, I would like to introduce you from the way I see you, Miko.
Great.
So when I see you and when I think about you, the most kind of apparent thought that comes to my mind is Miko is the person who fearlessly stands up for what is not right and brings it up to the community, and it has a really good discussion about things because you, Miko, you don't jump to conclusions, and you always want to make sure that things are fair, that things are right. And I think that you push the boundary and the limits of what people think fairness even is. And time after time after time, I think I see you do it, and your kindness comes to my mind. And then after that, your mind is just so brilliant. Your thought is so deductive, and you go in a depth of conversations, and you always do it with this gentle grace and courtesy for considering other person. You have so much love for everybody. And I think that even when you see somebody do wrong, and you bring that to attention of people, you still do it with kindness, and I really appreciate it. And so I'm blessed to have this conversation with you. I miss you, Miko, so much, and my goal is to share more with viewers who you are, because there's much more of you than what people think, which is venture capitalist, right? Which is, by the way, guys, it's an amazing and extremely hard work. And I think it's overly glorified by those people that are not in the industry. And it really almost kind of a nightly thing to do to be venture capitalist. So without further ado, Mika, I want to go ahead and jump right into kind of the depth of it. Why from I'm looking at my notes, because I want to make sure that I say it right. From neuroscience, how from neuroscience you decided to go into marketing for all things? What attracted you in marketing? And let's start like at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I've always been interested in sort of behavior, right? So behavior is really like I think the linchpin. And so for me, when you think about neuroscience, like neuroscience is really just using this quantitative sort of mathematical and analytical mechanisms to sort of understand behavior, right? So, obviously behavior is sort of the output of the brain system. And so, it's a very interesting field. I think from the perspective of kind of the evolution of that interest, it really kind of comes to understanding behavior, much from more from a sort of a, I guess I would say the fundamentally quantitative approach, but at the same time, trying to understand it in a more commercial context, right? Because I think the thing that happens is that academia has sort of increasingly, uh, you know, become, I think, it's sort of a esoteric pursuit, right? Which is that, people, I think success in academia is when there's only one other lab in the world that actually understands what you're working on, as opposed to, commercial success, which I think actually also can be pretty impactful. I think as long as it's, principled, and as long as it's, providing a valuable service to the world.
Yeah. And so why from that to marketing? What attracted you in marketing? Because I mean, you have an MBA, you have psychology, right?
Yeah.
And you have neuroscience education. So from that, why do you choose to go into marketing? And of course, to clarify to viewers too, Miko's first fund was in '05 in Silicon Valley, and
Yeah, that
I
was
did
that
not know
was
that.
those were quite interesting times. I think the the dot-com thing had kind of came and went, which I think is really interesting and instructive if you've ever been through one of these kind of significant, you could call it a market bubble event. But I would say in order to connect the dots, the thing that I think is really important to understand is sort of the principles of kind of digital marketing, which is really mostly about kind of constantly applying the scientific method, right? So in a way, the ultimate question of a marketer is, why would somebody do that, right? That's the question. So what you do is you basically just ask that question uh, a lot, right? And the way that you ask the question, I think, is it's a balance between sort of the qualitative and the quantitative, right? So the qualitative means that you develop affinity, you develop an intuition, about the behaviors, right? And then, the quantitative becomes that you put this to the test, right? So you basically start to think about like, okay, uh, you know, let's see, right? So you have a hypothesis, and you're like, okay, the reason why people are exhibiting a certain behavior is based on a certain need, right? And so then, one way to prove that out is just to, run some experiments, right? So largely, that's kind of the role. And if you look at the marketing from a commercial perspective, it really is sort of just automating these measurable outcomes, right? And the measurable outcomes are all behaviors, right? They're all, and so the thing that's interesting when you kind of zoom the lens out far enough is that, it allows you to define marketing as something that's very expansive, right? That starts to touch things like products, because, when you look at things like mobile products sort of, a lot of the behavior stuff and the automation happens in the context of applications, right? So you have these apps, and a free app is actually not really engineering, and it's not really product. A free app is really marketing, because if it's free, you're not selling it. So what you're selling is maybe something else. Um, and sometimes that's not such a great thing, right? Like, for example, Facebook is a free app, and what you're selling the data that probably should belong to the users, right? But you're selling it anyway for advertisers, and that's not necessarily such a good thing. But it's a way of reasoning about what the product actually is, right? People, I think it's kind of already a tired adage to say that in Facebook, like, you're the product, because the product doesn't charge money, right? You're not paying for the product, you're actually just becoming the product.
What I love about current world and where we are now is that we have new values in things like data. I think that without highlight of these experiences to where, okay, my data is being sold and my privacy matters to me, I think that because in some ways I think of what we see happening on platforms like Facebook and others, I think that it allows us as a society come up and say, oh, actually, yeah, I do not like this. And finally, I think that what's awesome is that blockchain technology now allows us to come in and say, okay, well, we can actually start doing interesting things to where, with the token distribution, every time you participate in conversation or whatever, you can set your measurements of how you get compensated for your interaction. Rewards kind of go to you, while they can also benefit the platform, because platform has to make money. And so when you said that, I right away thought about blockchain and the future, and let's dive into that. Tell us what is new, what is best, and what should we look forward to?
Yeah, so just first of all, on the first principles, like, I definitely agree. The thing that's really interesting about kind of the blockchain technology is, at its core, the thing that it's enabling is scarcity, right? And rarity, right? And so the thing that's funny about the previous model of the internet is that it's all based on kind of information which is sort of freely copyable, right? So the idea is that, if you have information on the internet, it's so easy to freely copy, right? So the free copying of information, I think, went through this kind of boom and bust cycle, in the sense that freely copying information initially was incredibly helpful, and it was incredibly exciting. I think if you remember the earliest days of the internet, the idea that information could be free and it could be flowing and it could go anywhere across the planet, like people got very excited about that, and they were like, wow, this is amazing, right? But now we're kind of reaching the limits of the value of all information being so cheap and easy and free to copy, right? So, for example, one of the things that's scary is that unless you have protection, things like your credit card are now being sold for free on the internet, and like images of your driver's license and your passport are being sold for easily and cheaply, almost for free on the internet, and your passwords are being sold on the dark web. And so all of this is just the natural result. The other thing that's being sold very cheaply is your privacy, your behavior, to advertisers and everything else, right? And all of this is just the result of what I would characterize as sort of extreme commoditization of the tendency for things to be free and copy and paste, right? So it's so easy to copy and paste. So everything is being copied and pasted. And because everything's being copied and pasted, the value is being kind of very degenerated down to close to zero. So the thing that I think is happening in the context of blockchain is, I think, first of all, we need to understand blockchain as kind of an extension of cryptography, right? So the thing that cryptography introduces is it introduces protection from the copying, right? So, instead of like, oh, I'm just going to copy whatever you have, and then I'm just going to make a billion copies of whatever it is that you have, right? I think what cryptography asserts there's actually now a place that can be on the internet or off the internet. It doesn't matter where it is, but whatever this place is it's a place where it's difficult for me to copy, right? So now I can't, and the reason why I can't copy it is because of the mathematics of cryptography, right? Which is I don't have a way of seeing what you have, right? And when I do see what you have, it doesn't mean anything because it looks like gibberish, right? So I got your cryptographic information, which is what the blockchain is based on, right? So anyone can go to the blockchain and see everything, right? And there's some information on the blockchain that is not, encrypted, right?
Yeah,
Things
and
like
that maybe shouldn't be there either.
yeah. But there's wonderful things like the transaction ledger, which are not encrypted, right? So anyone could just read it and be like, "Oh, Ellis paid Bob 1 Bitcoin." But what we don't know is we don't know who Ellis is, and we don't know who Bob is, because that is encrypted, right? And so, like, so for me, that's the beginning of something. But the thing that I think Satoshi did to bring it up a notch, to kick it up a notch, was really the creation of this quantifiable digital scarcity, right? So if you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin has, I think it's, north of 17 million units, 17 million Bitcoins, but it's going to asymptotically cap out, at 21 million, for all time, right? And so the thing that's kind of neat about that is that you now have this sort of invention of not just kind of this idea of privacy, but you also have this idea of scarcity, right? So that's really, I think, innovative and novel, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to build sort of a new internet, right? And I'm very resistant to kind of all of this nomenclature around like Web 3 and this kind of stuff, because I don't actually think there was a Web 2, right? I think that if you actually look at the web protocols, right, the web protocols didn't get upgraded, right? So we didn't rewrite the protocols of the internet during so-called Web 2. So there was no Web 2, right? All that happened,
The marketing, right? It goes
it was
back
marketing.
to marketing and
Yeah.
how do we
Yeah,
build
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
excitement.
yeah. And there's good marketing and bad marketing. But
Yeah,
to me, like, that was bad marketing because, like, when you version something, you rewrite rewrite it. So if you have a version 2 software, you rewrite the software, and nobody rewrote the software of the internet. All that happened during Web 2 is that a bunch of things that already existed in Web 1 that people didn't realize were already there were really suddenly made visible in public, right? So people talk about things like mobile, right? So it's like, oh, guess what? Mobile devices can access the internet. It's like, well, yeah, that was part of the whole thing. Social media, oh, that's part of Web 2. No, that was part of Web 1 too. So like nothing new arose, and if there were a version 2 of the internet, it would be blockchain, right? Like
Yeah.
that would be the real rewrite, because that's fundamentally novel technology. Now, would it even be fair to call it Web 2? I don't even think it would be fair. And the reason why I don't think it's fair is that the base protocol didn't get rewritten. This is just a new application, right? Like,
And
in other words, like TCP IP protocol is still the same, right? The underlying base layer is the same. But the thing that's so interesting is that a really, really disruptive kind of middleware has been created. And what it's done is it's transformed the internet into a place where it's basically cheap and free to freely copy and paste any information, right, to a place where it becomes, much, much more difficult, right? And the reason why this is important is people say, oh, but isn't it just cryptography only, right? And it isn't just cryptography only. And the reason why I'd like to assert that is that, like, we've had cryptography for a really long time, right? But even though we have cryptography, there are still sort of huge databases of hundreds of millions of users that are being sold, including their passwords, on the dark web, right? So cryptography alone is not really sufficient. It actually requires decentralization, which is kind of a new capability that came in with blockchain, where now there's no database to steal, right? So in a case of decentralization, you actually have data that can be collected from the proper people who have the rights to collect that data according to the rules of the application. But there isn't a centralized database. There's not one big pile of data that can be easily copied. And that's the innovation that makes it possible to kind of have much more secure, much more private information. So I haven't answered your original question, which is what's new, but because I'm really talking about what's new as of, like, October 31st, 2008. So I'm really in a time machine here, talking about what's new. But I'm happy to also kind of move the time forward to today if you want.
yeah, and also what you're explaining, it's not quite yet a reality, right? So the fundamentals for it have been laid out, but it's not impacting lives of people to where now that's a new reality for everybody in the world.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, that's the thing, is that what we're talking about is sort of a fundamental shift at the protocol layer, and you could describe, like, obviously the internet is made up of low level and higher level protocols. So you have, like, for example, the World Wide Web, which is, what we look at in our browsers, is hypertext transfer protocol, which sits on top of TCP IP, right? So the thing that, which is the internet protocol, right? But if you look at something like Bitcoin, Bitcoin also sits. So Bitcoin should be considered like a middleware protocol, and obviously, like, there are ways of using Bitcoin that don't necessarily depend on internet protocol. You could actually use a different lower level transfer, protocol at layers 3 and 4. But, like, my point is that the innovation rests at this kind of middleware. And the reason why I call it middleware is that, like, we still have lots of application work to do, right? So, what's happening now with Bitcoin and others is that what we're doing is we're exposing the infrastructure and the limitations of the infrastructure to the users, right? So if you have to imagine an electricity system where there's no outlets and there's no sockets, right? And if you ever want to use electricity, you have to go into a hole in the wall and you have to figure out which wires to connect to which other wires, and then you can start using the electricity, right? So that's not a good experience,
It's
so
such a good description. It's so spot on.
I mean, but it means that the infrastructure exists, right? It means that electricity is there in your wall, right? Which is good, right? So if you're an electrician, like, that's great. Like, if you're an electrician, you're like, well, I'm happy. Like, if I want lights, I could just wire them up. Like I could just go in my wall, I can put my lights, and it's like, I have lights. Like this is really great. I have a desk fan. Okay, I want air to blow on me. I'm just gonna wire it up, you know. And so right now, all the electricians are having a good time because they're like, this is really fun. This is great, but it's not ready for, you know, prime time. Like it's not, you know, it's not, you know. So there's work to be done, clearly.
Is there any projects right now that you're kind of most passionate about that you think that, you know, is a good thing to keep on an eye on that will make this a reality?
Yeah. I definitely have dozens of projects that I'm super excited about. You know, my fund, Gumi Cryptos. We're invested in a bunch of like projects that you know I personally have a lot of passion for. I'm super excited about those. You know, I'm excited. One of the things I'm excited about, which I think fits more in the nerd category, is like DeFi. So decentralized finance. That's obviously very exciting. Um, you know, there's just dozens of areas of innovation. Although I would say that principally my interests in the innovation segment are focused on things like financial services, you know, because it turns out like we talked about things like data privacy. Like we do have one portfolio company called Keyless, and it has this really amazing authentication technology that's based on basically this thing called multi-party computation, or MPC, and it creates an MPC network. And the idea becomes that if you remember, we were talking about, you know, like Marriott hotels lost like, I think it was like, I don't remember, 50 million user like data, this kind of thing, you know. So the idea behind Keyless is that you can have a decentralized network that holds authentication information, biometric uh, information, right? So the thing that's cool about something like that is that, you know, there is no central database. So you can't hack this centralized database. What you end up with is you end up with like millions of individual discrete points that you have to hack, right? So if you want 50 million data records, you need to hack 50 million encryption keys, you know. So it becomes very hard, you know. And
Problem.
so
Yeah, not worth
so
it. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm excited about technology like that. I do think it's early for things like social networks, and it's early for things like you know. So for example, like if you take my metaphor of like electricity, you know, like the thing that would be invented next might be like the light socket. You know, so it's like, oh, the light socket would be a great invention, right? Other inventions that would be really cool would be like a fuse box, so that, you know, if you put too much power, it doesn't like burn your house down, you know, stuff like that, you know. So stuff like that is going to be invented. But the thing that I think is important to understand is that, you know, I gave an example of keyless, but like I think the more likely examples that will come sooner will be related to, you know, financial infrastructure, right?
Yeah, I
So, you
agree
know,
with that as well. And I think it really comes down to the single source of truth, right? So I think that it really allows us to, uh, I don't like to say eliminate because elimination scares, especially, you know, traditional finance world, but light up the burden for the intermediaries and kind of move money around faster. So DeFi, decentralized finance, is a big topic of conversation right now. And obviously, we know what it is. Would you explain to viewers that are not familiar with what that means, and really especially address the concern of decentralization? Because I think a lot of people believe that it is decentralized platforms, the centralized finances that allows them to have safety, right? So I'll give you an example. For my mom, she has her bank account and she has her card, you know, and she has her credit card. And if her credit card gets hacked, she files this, you know, report and thing, and you know, she feels safe, she feels comfortable with that. And when we say decentralized, I think a lot of people just think like we're gonna break it all apart and throw it into the void of the universe. So how will it work? Why does this matter? And how does it make lives of consumers better?
Yeah. I first of all, I wanted to make just a tiny footnote about what you were talking about when you used, the term eliminate and then you softened it, right? So I don't look at it that way because I'm really focused on open source software, right? And so the thing that is so amazing about open source software is 100% what I call yes and, right? It's a 100% constructive and creative environment that is entirely based on yes and, right? Which is that what is open source software? It's like a giant repository in the sky, right? And thousands and thousands of developers just offer free software. They just put software into the sky and they're like, this is my work. I worked really hard on this. I hope you like it, right? That's what open source software is, right? And so if you look at it from that perspective, right, the thing that you have to understand is if you look at the history of the software industry, right now, like go if you look at, like, the stock market's crazy right now, but if you look at some of the most valuable companies in the world, aside from like Saudi Aramco and this kind of thing, you're talking about Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Netflix, others, right? And but if you look at all of those companies, the entire base platform that they're resting on is open source software, and like they're contributing as well as benefiting from open source software. And so what I'm suggesting with financial infrastructure is that it won't eliminate or replace, right? In fact, the proprietary financial infrastructure will be more valuable than it's ever been, right? But all of the base layer functions that are a commodity are going to be replaced by free software, right? So free software is beautiful because it's free, right? And it's free. The reason why, beyond just being free, as in free beer, as beyond being just kind of like, hey, it doesn't cost you money, right? It's also this notion that it is consent based, right? So nobody can force you to use free software, right? Like, so what it means is it means that it competes for your consent, right? So it basically offers you something, and it's like, oh, do you want to try this? And then it's like, oh, you don't? Okay, that's fine. Like, do you want to try the other one? Or do you want to try one that's almost exactly the same, right? Because it's free, someone else copied it, and then they made a slightly different one. So it's like, oh, do you want to use that one? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, I do. Like, I really want to use that one. It's like, great. Like, knock yourself out. Here it is, right? So to me, the spirit of it is not, it's a very non-threatening spirit, because it's very much kind of like, oh, it's free software, and what is the goal of free software? It's to reduce the cost of infrastructure, but because it reduces the cost of infrastructure, it actually increases the rates of innovation, and it also increases inclusion and participation. So anyhow, that's my long rant. But what I wanted to talk.
I agree with you. I think though a lot of people think that they fear the elimination of their roles, and and like you said, it's just an evolution. But let's go to the
Defy.
yes, defy.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I'd love to kind of mention, because I know that you're really kind of advanced in your sort of thinking about, humanity and the, evolution and progress of humanity. So like, to me, the thing that's so amazing about what you're describing about this notion of, can I trust decentralized versus centralized, is that um, this is really, in some level, kind of, I would call it almost a transcendental moment in human evolution, because the idea becomes like, um, we're sort of progressively moving towards kind of a different status, and the question becomes, can we transcend these evolutionary impulses, right? 'Cause, here, let me give you the so this all sounds very sort of speculative, right? But let me kind of boil it down to brass tacks, right? Which is that humans are what I call high investment mammals, right? So the fact that we're mammalian means that we, as a species, we have like milk production. Like, that distinguishes mammals. That's what we do. And what is milk production? Milk production basically means uh, essentially a fairly high investment in offspring, right? So like, if you take something like fish, right? Like, a fish will like okay, now here's like 5,000 eggs, and like, now we're gonna make 5,000 fish, and like, each one of those fish is not going to like individually be nursed by the fish, and some fish reproduction is really impersonal, right? Which is a fish will like, fish will put the eggs, in the sand, and then another fish that they don't even know will come up and fertilize the eggs, right? So it's sort of like, well, they didn't even meet, so like so that's fish reproduction, right? But if you want to go back to mammals, right? So this is all I'm getting to the point here. So the point is this: the point is that we're born with an authority, right? We come out of the womb, and as soon as we come out of the womb, we're subject to an authority, right? Like we're basically uh and the authority in this particular case, since we're mammals, like it's a feminine authority in the sense that, like, like the mom, and I don't want to get too far into this kind of biological determinants of sociobiology and
But I
this
mean,
kind of thing, because that
there's
gets
definitely a mother figure who is connected to a child,
correct,
and it is
correct,
an
correct.
authoritative. Yeah,
Yeah. So it gets, and so if you look at it from a model perspective, right, like what does the organism need, right? So it needs protection, right? So the thing that happens, like the mother's arms are basically protecting, right? And then it needs nutrition, right? And the mother itself is like providing nutrition. So in a sense, like what's happening is that this small organism is kind of weak and vulnerable, and requires, and the thing that's so funny about humans in particular is that humans in particular come out especially weak and especially vulnerable and especially not that effective, right? Like, for example, if you look at reproduction of something like deer, right? Like if you look at, deer, like what happens is like Bambi comes out of the mom and then, is wobbly, but then like in a few minutes, Bambi's running, is able to run away, right? And not only can Bambi run away, but Bambi also has this kind of feeling of like, um, what is a threat, right? Bambi has an individual concept of like, oh, that looks like a dangerous, I'm going to run this way or I'm going to run that way, right? Like human babies don't run from anything because they can't, like they just don't have the capability and they don't even have the capability of understanding what's a threat. The only thing they're able to do is they're able to kind of look at their mom and be like, what is that large brown object, and if the
yeah.
mom is scared, then they're like, okay, that's a scary thing. And if their mom is not scared, then they're like, okay, that's not a scary thing. So why does this matter? Why does this matter? And the reason why it matters is that we're evolved to effectively kind of submit to authority. Like we're evolved to be, and we're evolved to be fearful. And when we get fearful, we are basically evolved to submit to an authority, right? So the existence of this pattern is such that we have this concept of an alpha and a beta, right? And alpha is sort of the dominant party, and the beta is the submissive party, right? So, I realize there's some creepiness to all of this, right? Like when you talk about it this way, it's sort of like it's kind of icky, right? So it's sort of like, wow, this isn't good, right? This isn't like how it could be. It could be so optimal, and this is not. It doesn't sound optimal. Like it doesn't sound very good, right? But I guess on the plus side, the way that I'd like to frame it is evolution's trying to do the best it can, right? Like it hasn't completed its course. We're still working on this. We're still a
I
work in
hope so.
progress.
I mean, that means we're growing and evolving and progressing, or maybe
Ideally,
regressing.
ideally, but here's the thing that I think my point is bringing it all the way home, right? So
Yeah.
the thing that you described a person who's kind of like, I really can't trust this decentralized thing, like it makes me nervous, like it's weird, like where does it go? It's going into the ether, like, like what is this thing? Oh, it's called Ethereum. Like is it ethereal? Like is it just air? Like, is there anything solid here? I don't understand. And so in a sense, the thing that people are kind of really struggling with is this feeling of like, well, so who's in charge? Right? Who's in charge? Like how can we exist if there's nobody who's kind of like dominating and nobody who's kind of ruling over us, and and whoever is dominating should be like powerful and scary, right? Like I hope they're powerful and scary because then when the bad tribe shows up, like the powerful and scary alpha can kind of chase them away, right? So that's kind of how evolution has kind of put us in this condition. So because of that, it's my thought that something like a Bitcoin, is really a transcendental experiment, right? It's a transcendental project, in the sense that like it's a project that doesn't have a central figure, right? Like if you look at the mythology of Bitcoin, you have Satoshi Nakamoto, who is kind of like, oh, well, is Satoshi the boss of this? Is he in charge of this? And it's like, well, no, like because it's decentralized, right? So but people want there to be that kind of figure. So to me, like I unfortunately it's hard to properly answer the question, right? And but I'll give it my best shot, right? Which is, why should a normal person trust a system that doesn't have this property that we're so familiar with, right? We're so familiar with like the boss, right? It's like, oh, I'm looking for boss, it's just so deep, right? The idea that there's a boss, right? And we're born with a boss, so like why wouldn't there be a boss in this situation, right? So the thing that I think is important to try to understand about Bitcoin and all of its cousins, all the kind of blockchain based assets, is that the reason why we need this kind of infrastructure as an alternative is because when you centralize things, you end up, the world is sort of imperfect by nature, right? And so because the world is imperfect, you end up with the opportunities for centralized authorities to behave in abusive ways or corrupt ways or generally bad ways, right? And so what happens when you have something that is decentralized is that it's just really just rules, right? So something like Bitcoin, it behaves according to rules, right? So then the thing becomes, oh, well, how do we know? How do we trust these rules? What's up with these? Who makes the rules, right? So um, the point being is that the rules are basically written in software, right? So it just means that you can just read the rules, you can know what the rules are, and the system will behave according to those rules. And so instead of having a world that's kind of run by some boss, it's run by rules, right? So people who find that attractive, I think, can get a benefit. They can get a benefit from participating in a world that's governed by rules as opposed to governed by sort of the whims of some authority.
Yeah. And I think that also what's interesting is that you get to vote with what rules you want to follow. And so you, especially now that there are different protocols, you can actually decide what behaviors of those rules that you appreciate. And then by participating it, you strengthen the power of those rules. And to me, that's really wonderful. I do think we live in a wonderful time. I know it's very hard for people right now to think that way because, everywhere we look, there's all this bad news and even the things that are happening that are normal, highlighted as like Armageddon things, that's very, very normal of the reality. And I hope that basically we're kind of approaching the time where people can say, okay, you know what? I do want I do want to know better what really is really happening, and I do want to be able to be functioning outside of the centralized systems and get the power and get the security to myself. Obviously in countries that are first world countries, we do have a sense of security, and I think in some ways it's probably in some ways eventually it will be a false sense of a security, right? But there's a sense of a security that, it's a good thing. But in other countries, it is very well known that it is not, So I come from Russia and I
Yeah.
lived through the change of Soviet Union to to what Russia is right now, and as well through what it means, through the economical changes and through complete crashes and collapses and all of that. And the trust is kind of a not an assumed thing. It's like a question of
Yes.
whether I want that or not. And so, to me, when Justin and I we started, when we got into the space and we built Bitcoin exchange, which eventually we pivoted. It was way too early. U.S.-based security, U.S.-based Bitcoin exchange in 2013 was a fool's errand.
Amazing.
Yeah, but my basically this was the last draw for us. A relative of mine died, and we were sending $500 to them to help to pay for funeral and to pay for things, which is a lot of money in Russia. And it cost us over $100 to wire that money. And so that's when Justin said, let's send Bitcoin. And it was like, no, because he said, well, there's this currency, Bitcoin, and we've been looking at it and all that. And it was like, no, we just can't do it with
And
cash.
Justin's one of those electricians, so
Yes,
he's
yes,
very
he is. He
comfortable.
is definitely the electrician, and he's been driven by building the infrastructure, and I've been building by promoting people building an infrastructure. I'm not a coder, don't code, but that was the big difference for us, and I think that it changes for people that are living in the countries where there is no stability. I think that what we're building here in US and other countries too in this DeFi, it makes difference in their lives right now. Every single progress, and I think it makes their life better. It makes their children's lives better, and it makes impact on them right
Well,
now.
and I think that the thing that is nice actually is that, like, if you look at something like a Bitcoin, like Bitcoin is sort of a utility, and it's a completely like consensual utility, so anyone can kind of use it, right? And so to me, like, uh people don't actually have to use, somebody has to use it, but like every single person doesn't have to use it to even be a beneficiary. And the reason why I assert this, the reason why I assert this is it's providing a utility function in the economy, right? And the utility function is that it provides a counterweight to kind of inflation, right? Because if you look at inflation, inflation promotes sort of wealth inequality, right? So it really creates this kind of schism between sort of the capital class, the investment class, and the kind of non-investment class, right? Dare I say the working class, right? And so you know so because of that, like, so if you think about inflation, I absolutely, it's important to look at these countries, right? So if you look at like Venezuela, or if you look at an Argentina, even to some extent like modern economies like Turkey, which has had some hyperinflation, Zimbabwe, like, a lot of these countries where you just have very high rates of inflation, you know um it can be very difficult, right? And so the thing that becomes interesting is, what if there is a mechanism to offset the power of centralized authorities to print arbitrary amounts of money, right? Because inflation is essentially a regressive tax, right? So if I'm a central bank, if I can basically devalue whatever currency you have by increasing the size of the pile of currency I have, right? So I can, so because of that, it's taxation, right? And so I think it's one of the things that's interesting about inflation is it's quite it's effective, right? And what I mean by it's effective is that I don't actually have to collect the value from you. And so from a perspective of like the mechanics, it just means that every single person holding a single dollar of your currency suddenly has less, and the central authority suddenly has more, right? And so you don't have to levy the tax, and you don't have to go around and collect it and calculate it and do all this complicated stuff. You can just get the money, right? So I guess to me, coming back to this, if you go, like, one of the things that the world is in struggle about is authoritarianism, right? So I think one of the things that's fascinating that we're seeing unfolding before our eyes, that you might have some interesting insight around, is what's happening in Belarus with Lukashenko, right? So, like, that's a really dynamic situation. And, I think that, what you have is ostensibly, an apparently authoritarian regime, and you have kind of a really interesting current dynamic around, opposition, and I think we're seeing so many different authoritarian dynamics unfolding, right? Like, even in Russia, we're having political dissidents that, appear to have been sort of poisoned spontaneously, and so there's so many dynamics right now that where the world is sort of struggling with authoritarianism, which is really kind of the dark result of, like, centralization.
Centralization. And I think that it's so wonderful that we find, because centralization and these problems, it's not a new problem. We've been having this as a reoccurring situation with what it's like to be living on Earth. And I think that it's so great that we finally have these structures that are coming out, that are proposing alternative ways of being, and it's not just a hypothetical one day we will be able to implement the, let's say, gifting economy and using sacred economics structures, but really really be able to say, okay, well, we have the tools. It might not happen today, but we have the tools. We can do this, people. So, like, stay positive, keep on working on that, and keep delivering and building. I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of you know, what would you advise to people that are at home, because everybody is at home right now, and that are having a hard time, that are not maybe finding a way to get themselves out and going as far as energetically, and looking at the world with a positive perspective. You're such a light and you're such a joy that I would love for you to share your little tools or big tools with people about that.
Well, I appreciate that. And, like, I can't really claim any kind of special knowledge, other than, my own toolbox, right? Because from my perspective, like, everyone kind of is going through the mud, and in a sense we're kind of going through the mud together. I think different people have different layers of privilege, and they have privilege as a function of their racial and economic groups and their gender, and things like that. So from my perspective, like, I definitely have sort of a privileged status, here in Silicon Valley as kind of a North Asian American, and so, like, it's hard for me to kind of really comment, but, with respect to kind of like, how do I sort of deal with the kind of troubles that come from being a human, I think the first thing I want to outline is just kind of my way of looking at this experience, right? Which is, I think that, I identify myself as a non-theistic Buddhist, right? And I think the, original Buddha defined the world as actually having this property of kind of disjointedness or disconnectedness, right? And so if we're going to try to understand what was meant, I like to kind of think about it as like, can you make a perpetual motion machine, right? So it's basically a thought exercise of a perfect machine that kind of runs forever, right? And as soon as you try to build a perpetual motion machine, you end up with three fundamental problems, right? The three fundamental problems are, first of all, is you need energy to run the machine, right? And it's like, well, why do you need energy, right? And the reason why you need energy is because the machine experiences friction, right? So what is the friction, right? So the friction is, oh, it turns out that there's minor, tiny, microscopic imperfections in this machine. And what's happening is that the gears of the machine are now grinding because of these imperfections, right? And so in order to overcome this resistance and grinding, we have to put energy into it, right? So we have to put energy into this machine, right? So that's the first problem you have is you're like, oh, all production of work is friction, right? So that's a statement, and I think it's sort of a fact of existence, which is anything that produces work is going to encounter friction, right? So in a way, like that part of my toolbox is sort of expecting it. So it's sort of like, when you're trying to build something or do something and it goes badly, like you can always kind of be in like well, why did this happen to me? This is terrible. And it's kind of like that's just there's no escape. There's no escape. Like you're going to encounter friction. So what does it mean then that you have friction, right? So the next step that's interesting is that you have to add energy, right? So it's like, wow, I have to add energy. That's the only way you can overcome friction is by adding energy, right? But then if you think about it, one of the next things that you immediately hit is if you're trying to build a perpetual motion machine, what you hit is that there isn't any source of unlimited energy, right? So that's also kind of upsetting because you're like, oh man, like I'm looking for unlimited energy. I want unlimited energy because otherwise, how can I possibly make this machine that I'm trying to make? Right. And so you just look around, you look around, you look around, and you're like, there isn't any. There's no source of unlimited energy. So what you're talking about are just limitation, right? So we're living in a world of friction. We're living in a world of limitation. We're living in a world of imperfection, right? And then the final step to this thing is what's the result of applying a nearly unlimited energy source to a machine that has microscopic friction? Like let's say it's like dust and like things and grinding and things like that. Eventually the machine will break down, right? Because it will grind itself to dust, right? And so the third thing that I'm pointing out here is this entropy, right? So, things just fall apart, right? So then the question becomes, oh, well, so what you're saying is you're saying that all production of work has friction, that there's all that energy is inherently limited, and that things fall apart by their nature, right? So I think that all sounds pretty dark, but but if you start from there, then um what happens is that when you hit something, then you should ask yourself, well, how did you expect? Like, what did you expect it to do? And yes, like that's what you expected it to do, right? You expected it to run out of energy. You expected it to be resistant and difficult, and you expected it to fall apart. Like that's what you expected, right? And so, it sounds pretty bleak, to be honest. But, um, I think that because so for me, those are axioms. So what I mean by that is that these are like this is a way of unpacking what's sort of fundamental about the world, and so it's it's unfortunate, right? So the idea becomes like, there are things that are sort of you know um one of the tips that I like to espouse is that I like to espouse that despite all of this, there are still moments of perfection, right? What we are offered is we're offered like perfect moments. So we're able to have, even despite all of these things, we're able to have momentary perfection. And the way I define momentary perfection is kind of funny, right? Which is you have a perfect moment, right? And then let's say something later on, like let's say, for example, like you have a relationship moment and it's like this perfect relationship moment, right? So no matter what happens later, you still had that perfect moment. So even if you like end up, having a divorce or whatever ends up happening later, right? It doesn't mean that moment that you had in the past was not perfect, right? So I guess what I'm really saying is, and it also doesn't mean that you can make perfection last, right? But the reality becomes like that could be enough. So I don't know. That's kind of the broad philosophical perspective. I think in terms of my toolbox, like one of the things that I do is I focus on habit formation. So I read a book called Atomic Habits, and I highly recommend the book because it has to do with making these tiny changes to your life that kind of he calls them like 1% changes, right? So the idea really rests on this concept of compounding interest, which is if you can improve something by 1%, then you can improve the next thing by 1%, and you keep improving things by 1%. And, if you just keep improving things in your life by 1%, then the whole thing can eventually be compounded and result in significant improvement, right? And the reason why I love this philosophy is because it focuses on small things that you can do something about, that you can control, and so it increases your sense of self-efficacy, because I think it's too easy in this world to spend a lot of time focused on things you can't control that are going to like stress you out and like generally ruin your life, and I'm not free from this kind of behavior, or, I think people participate in things like something called doom scrolling, where
Doom scrolling? What is doom scrolling?
doom scrolling. I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like, which is you go on the internet, you like surf and you scroll and you read the news and you just get more and more depressed, right? So you just keep reading about how we're all doomed, and like, that's kind of what you're trying to counteract, right? So the idea of Atomic Habits, it's a great book, is it really talks about how you can essentially design and program your own behavior to, just make these tiny, small improvements. And it's a very unambitious program because you're not trying to like light the world on fire. You're just trying to just improve a tiny, small thing in your life, and you just keep at it. You just keep doing tiny things in your life.
Yeah. And what it sounds to me like, take take those moments of take those moments that you have nurtured, that have been pleasant, and know that there will be again, and know that it's a transitional, right? That if you're experiencing negative things in your life, it is a transition, and maybe find a strength in yourself just to help yourself a little bit by creating tiny little habit. Don't change.
Yeah. And for me too, like one of the things that is sort of fueling sometimes is that, like, if I do get to feeling sort of some hopelessness, right? One of the things that I ask myself is I ask myself kind of like, is there something that the future me would have wanted done that I could do now? Right. So that then you're like, okay, well, I don't feel like doing anything, but I'm just going to do this small thing, kind of as a gesture to maybe some future version of myself, and then maybe in that future state I'll be like, oh, okay, I'm so glad that this got done, and so you're kind of like making a gesture, or you're making an offer to, your future self, right? So, because then it's kind of like, well, you're feeling kind of like, hopeless or meaningless, and you're just kind of like, what can I do? So, the thing that's interesting is that, like, if you get into this kind of a habit, what happens over time is that your future self, like, has these is now given these kind of presents from your past self, right? And so you start to build this relationship between your future self and your past self, where, and so when you do get into this kind of like mental states, then you can sort of like, um you can sort of be like, well, this totally feels meaningless, and it totally feels useless, and it feels hopeless, but um but you have kind of enough momentum where you're kind of like, yeah, I mean, this is really stupid, but it worked last time for some weird reason,
Yeah.
like
And
it's all.
often life is that way, to where, we think and project things into reality, and put so much meaning to them and hope for them, but really, with the things that materialize it themselves into a new interesting reality, is something that we might have just did by chance, I think I also use this philosophy as well. Think of myself of who I will become, and what when I look back at who I were, and what advice I would give myself, and then kind of a project of how that goes. I think it's just an interesting way of giving yourself a chance. I remember I remember somewhere I was really young, and the top regrets of people dying. Kind of like, what are the three top regrets that they have? And I remember thinking like, okay, when I grow up, if I look back, what will I regret that I didn't do right now, or that I'm doing right now, and I don't want to live in regrets. So there will be no regrets. I will make the decision. I'll be happy with it, and I'll push myself forward into that future reality. Okay, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Think forward to quarter century. So it's 2045. Describe our reality.
Yeah, this is a great exercise, right? Because just yesterday I was kind of looking at one of the scenes from Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the movie version by Stanley Kubrick, right? And the thing that's so amazing is when you actually look at this sort of technology transcendentalism that Arthur C. Clarke was kind of promoting, right? Like he really was kind of this sort of futurist and optimist, right? Because he was really all about kind of developing this vision for kind of a transcendental technology humanity, right? And so to me, like, I would say that it's very hard to practically project, right? Because when you really look at the pragmatism of it, like it's so hard to predict the timings of things. I would say the other thing that's so interesting is that, from year to year, it really seems like nothing at all ever changes. But I think in a 10-year span, if you actually go back in time, there will be things that have changed that will have really just subtly changed, just phenomenally and exponentially, right? So that's the thing that I think is really, important and complicated to prognosticate, right? So to me, like, what I can express is that, it's such a nonlinear exercise because there's so many dimensions. But I would say that one of the biggest hopes that I have is actually the development of sort of basically fusion energy technology, right? And we are making scientific progress towards it. And so when I talk about these problems, right, one of the problems that's interesting is this idea that we don't have an unlimited energy source, right? But the thing, and again, like fusion energy isn't unlimited, but it's very, very vastly, like, it has a ridiculous amount of capacity, right? And so the thing that becomes really interesting is what happens when we have this capability of vast, plentiful, and very cheap energy. Like what happens to the world and to society and to the economy and to human existence. I think that becomes kind of a very important thing, right? Because when you look at the other things that people talk about, they talk about things like entropy and the elimination of entropy. Like that's pretty complicated. People talk about things like longevity, and I think I'm not kind of bullish on longevity. I don't think people will live 1,000 years because of some amazing science, or people will like upload their brains into other bodies, and I don't believe in any of that. But I do feel like, if you look at these three problems of like entropy of things falling apart, and if you look at this idea of friction and like things being kind of grindy and like challenging and difficult and heavy, and you look at this kind of idea of the limitation of energy, the thing that, I would put my chips on is like that we're able to solve the third one locally. And what I mean by we're able to solve the third one locally is that it doesn't matter to human existence whether you have unlimited energy or not, as long as you're able to have as much energy as you want, right? Like as long as you have like, near unlimited as much energy as you want for as much time as you want, then functionally over that time period you have unlimited energy, right? So that becomes kind of the place where I would put my chips. So if I were to forecast, into that future, I would say that would be, potentially the single most decisive advancement. And there's really wonderful uh, primary research being done on this technology. I think it's a technology that has bad PR. Like I think,
Where
uh,
can one find more kind of information that they can relate to that does not require scientific knowledge, but would be actually, a non-fiction?
I actually like Science Daily. Like it's just a really nice website that kind of like summarizes scientific discovery as it is, and it's fairly objective about it, and obviously you can start studying some of these fusion energy experiments that are being promoted. We're actually building some very large fusion reactors, as kind of experiments towards achieving this kind of energy breakthroughs. So I think that kind of stuff can be potentially hugely impactful. I think it can potentially produce much better states. Like I think if you look at some of the tensions that are geopolitical, a lot of them have to do with things like fossil fuels. Obviously, problems like carbon emissions and global climate change, are impacted again by sort of fossil fuels. And so, I feel like fusion energy, the concept of so-called nuclear power, is really bad branding. It's really bad branding, right? Because there's only two kinds of power, right? There's chemical power and nuclear power. Those are the only two kinds of power that there are in the universe, right? And chemical power can be anything from driving a car to eating a carrot, right? So calling them all chemical power, like that's just dumb, right? And calling everything over on the other side nuclear power is also dumb because they just have completely different properties, right? So it's as different as eating a carrot is chemical power and driving a car is chemical power, right? So the idea that there's this big thing called nuclear power that everyone should be uniformly afraid of is just, it's a mistake. It's not, it's bad reasoning.
Sounds great. Well, and I think that we probably will evolve better to understand that better, right? So I'm hoping. And the more people talk about that, and I think that one of the things that would is great is that, you know, terminology can be invented, and let's just start naming it in a different ways. Just like in crypto space, that it's we kind of evolved to this new terminology that means its own things. So let's do it for the for
My
the
my candidate name for fusion is near Earth solar power. That's
Ooh,
my
I love it. I saw you posted that today, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's my candidate name, right? It's sort of near Earth solar. So that's
it's
and
beautiful.
obviously it's that's not a real name and that'll never stick, but like
We don't know, but let's
it's something that can at least kind of change how we
communicate something better.
conceptualize.
Yeah, and I think that's what language is. Language evolves, and we just need to make sure that we're communicating the properties of things that they do, and it will evolve. And you know what? I vote that near Earth solar power becomes a thing.
Thanks so much. Yeah. And I think that we are talking about kind of a broad projection of like human capability and like, very kind of far future scenarios, and like those, ideally the thing that I think we have to come back to is like hopefulness, and I think that it's really the world is hard enough as it is, and so like we have to kind of continue to have hope, against any odds, right? So no matter how dark things may get, like, it's just we have that optionality as humans, right? Like we can choose to hold on to hope even when we get more and more cynical and more embittered by kind of like life's kind of realities, like we still have that option. We still have the option of kind of choosing to hold on to hope, right?
Yeah,
And whatever those hopes are, like they're different. Like
yeah,
different people will
everybody's,
just choose their own hopes. But I
yeah,
feel like that's still something that is really essential and human. And I think during a dark time of struggle, like people are struggling for economic equality, they're struggling for equality of justice, they're struggling just to stay alive in this like viral pandemic. People are struggling across so many different economic dimensions, like record job losses, and so there's so many struggles against which people can be disempowered, disenchanted, and distressed and depressed, and and some of these things are like like pretty hard to evade, even if you have kind of economic means, like family members can be killed by a virus, and so things are dark for a lot of people, and it's hard to judge how different people are being impacted. But I would say that, like, if there is something to hang on to, like, we should definitely continue to have hope and to continue to sort of cultivate those hopes. But I would say that if there is a book, for a practical book for the pandemic, that I would recommend, it is Atomic Habits, and it's a book that can be kind of very iteratively and gradually transformative by being performative.
yeah. I think in darkness you find light, and light exists. There's darkness and there's light, and we go through the cycles. There's no good without bad. There's no bad without good. And so just hold on to there, like Miko said. Just know that things are going to turn around and they will be great. And I think that you and everybody, we all deserve that, and we, as long as we're doing that, the times will come and they will be good. And that goes the other way too, like you said, at some point, if there's a lot of energy and things start grinding, be ready for it, and know that that might be the time for recovery, that might be time for some internal work and for allowing yourself to rest, or maybe go and figure out where that sand is stuck that's grinding the things.
Yeah,
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 which is really a
absolutely.
painful situation,
It
right? Like
is. It
going
is.
inside is painful.
It is. Because the thing that is hard is that we can all imagine a world of perfection, right? So that's like, if we were not endowed with an imagination that had the capacity to imagine perfection, then we wouldn't be in such a disappointment, right? Because the thing that happens to us is that we imagine perfections, and then the world essentially falls short, right? That things in the world fall apart, that things in the world become full of friction and difficulty, and things in the world become full of limitation, right? That the limited emotional energy, limited commitment, limited trust, limited financial energy, limited, like, just limited power, limited attention, so it's just like we just hit all of these things, and it's I think that, just to kind of like tweak a little bit about your note that you're closing on, is that, I think it's okay that, like, I think you were saying that you should know that it will get better, right? And I my philosophy tends to be very kind of evidentiary, right? And so for me, I'm more interested in kind of what I would call a posture of hope, right? Which is that, in a sense, like, you can't actually know if it's going to get better. You can't know that, right? But what you can do is you can choose to take that as your posture, right? And that affects the present moment, right? Which is that if you go into the future with a posture that's a hopeful posture, so you can say, like, okay, well, you know I'm going to choose to believe that it's going to get better,
Yeah.
right? So that's your choice, right? And
And it
you know,
changes your now moment as well, right? So it
yeah,
improves your present moment.
that's right. That's right. But the thing is that like you have to acknowledge that there's no evidence, right? So you can't say, well, I know it's going to get better from an evidentiary perspective. But I think that what you're describing with that kind of concept of knowledge is more that it's energetically part of your posture,
Yeah.
right? That you really are like it will get better. Right. And that's important, right? Like, you don't know that, but like that's the energy, that's the posture, that's the like that's your stance. And I think that's that can be available, right? Like, obviously, like, I don't have the kind of depth of experience, but if you read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, like people in very dark circumstances are still able to manifest this posture, and that to me is like miraculous. So,
Sounds great. Miko, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you took your time. I know you're super busy. I'll make sure to post all the links to where people can contact you. I'm hoping that we can do this soon. And ideally, I see you in person sooner than the world is predicting. I do like to think that things are going to be more positive, faster in general. And yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy and disposition and really work that you do for community. You are so active in a community and growing and being like the reason. You're such a good just reason and leveling and centering.
well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. And, thanks for such a lovely introduction, and, really enjoy spending time with you and Justin. So, let's hang out if this
Yes,
COVID thing
I
allows.
know it will. I trust it will. Thank you, Miko. Bye. Mhm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye.